Hello, students and graduates. Welcome to Ph.D. Lounge, the podcast of late-night interviews where Ph.D. students have a drink and talk about their research topics. I am your host, Luis, and I hope that you have spent with your family and friends an excellent Christmas, New Year's Eve, and the 1st of January under a period that is still not favorable for huge grouping celebrations across the world. At Swansea, where I live, I celebrated Christmas with a bicycle ride to a location called Caswell and spent the New Year's Eve at one of my friend's house with his family. I can say that I had a good time despite the fact that I would love to have both festivities alongside my parents and my brother since they are far away from me. But well, that is the life of a student that I am used to. Anyway, Happy New Year 2022. Hoping that you manage to pass all your exams of the first term in January, which I know and understand that they are hard to study and pass all modules through final exams in just 1 month. If you have not passed 1 or 2 exams, do not worry. There is another opportunity to retake them wherever the country you are studying your BA and or MA, and where you have also time to check on some mistakes you may have done during these exams so that you can improve them and later pass those modules you have failed. I can say to you as well that I also failed to pass some first-term modules when I was a BA student, but sorted to approve afterwards, whilst passing the modules of the second semester by knowing those I had thought they were easy to pass, leaving others for the next academic year that required a bit more studying, which I did when I was living and studying in Spain during my Erasmus abroad period. I wish now all the best and success to all students for this second term. I welcome you too to the first 2022 session of the Ph.D. Lounge podcast, and I shall start with a solo one. And if you have tuned in to the reflections session this past December, I said that I would like to record an episode about the history of the doctoral dissertation, and it is exactly the topic I want to talk about. As we are familiar, or better, starting to familiarize ourselves with a written PhD thesis that is known as a hefty research with thousands of words to be orally presented before a panel of specialists, I think it could be important as well to know first about how this concept of dissertation originated throughout history, just as like the foundation and official consolidation of the PhD in the 19th century. This goes through its foundation, emergence, the bureaucratic aspects that delayed its official announcement as important feature of the PhD, what were the first obligations of a PGR student to write a doctoral thesis back then to obtain the Doctor of Philosophy degree before each university having their own system nowadays, the first dissertations in Europe and the rest of the world, examples of famous PhD dissertations, and some final thoughts of the feeling of a PhD student writing a thesis. But before I start the session, let me tell you that this topic was not easy to find sources, as I only found a few literary references that explain small details about the emergence of the doctoral thesis. But nonetheless, I will give my best to share what I researched throughout the session. I appreciate, therefore, your understanding. So, let's travel once again in history to dissect this time the emergence of the PhD dissertation. To kick off this session, I should ask the basic question that many students obviously know. What is a PhD dissertation? Straightforward. It is a document with limited word count where you develop a research theory using case studies or scientific experimentations to create and defend your arguments for a comprehensive audience, those being the specialists within your topic. For example, my research is around hybrid and third space concepts in Hellenistic and Roman urbanism and identity, where I have to defend at the viva voce my theory about hybridity and third space as key components of unifying Near Eastern peoples with Greeks, Parthians, and Romans towards a panel of experts in Hellenistic and Roman studies in the Near East. However, what does a dissertation really consist of? Fundamentally, dissertation is just a written document where you reproduce your thesis so that it can be read by the experts of your field. The word thesis is the formation of an oral thought or argument developed through new and fresh ideas over a topic that is either has been developed but with new approaches, or something that has not been widely researched and that can contribute to the existing scientific knowledge. In ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle are said to be the developers of this conception, and when writing was possible within academic contexts, then the thesis, i.e. the research idea, would be possible to be shown, defended, and then judged whether or not it would contribute to the existing knowledge. Nowadays, thesis and dissertation are often interchangeable, which both turn to have the same meaning, but in practice they are rather different. In the end though, we tend to call dissertation and thesis into a piece of written paper after all. Traveling back in time, developing an academic idea or the thesis was around the concept and foundation of university during the Middle Ages, when the Magister of Arts was the top degree, later being widely developed during the Renaissance, specifically during the Protestant Reformation, alongside with the suggestion of a reform of the educational system regarding degrees in Europe by Germanic scholars, and then throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. The concept of thesis at that time was through a dissertatio, which means a presentation of ideas, followed by a disputatio or disputation, a ceremonial scholarly debate between arguments to reach conclusions and understandings between the involved parties. This system of theses were made orally, and it was a common practice during these times, because on one hand the obtention of a degree was a disputation itself, where students were disputing against each other as respondents or candidates at a lower podium, and those who were successful during the debate, then they would elevate to the upper podium, becoming masters or doctors. On the other hand, students who wanted to become teachers at university, their disputation of their thesis or academic ideas could take days or months to obtain a place within academia, even if they were awarded with the title doctor or master at the upper podium. During the 16th century, the theses were an academic accessory for graduation and disputation ceremonies, just like what we see today when BAs, MAs, and PhDs are celebrating graduation with huge events given by their respective universities. And those ceremonies were presided over by a panel of professors who organized and promoted the disputatio, where the panel was at the upper podium, while the students or candidates were on a lower podium to discuss their thesis with them. And around the graduation room were academic officers, academic members from an academic society, and nobility individuals watching and listening to the discussion. If you have attended a thesis oral presentation, you might have seen the experts panel holding the dissertation of the student while the latter was presenting his arguments, subsequently followed by a debate between both parties where the student had to defend his claims so that the experts could approve his graduation. At the end of this century and throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the theses had a wind of change as they started to be reproduced on papers. And from here comes the famous word dissertation. We do not know where and how the idea came from, but from that century onwards, the thesis printed on documents became a customary practice that spread across other universities in Europe first and in the rest of the world second. However, printed dissertations of disputations would have been passed first by the professors/presiders, as it is said that they would write the thesis of the candidates or respondents and then circulated them in advance before the day of the disputation ceremony. In other words, the student/candidate that was part of the graduate ceremony would formulate his idea, while the professor/presider wrote it before the respondent having his debate at the graduation ceremony. The upper and lower podium system set at the disputatio ceremony would as well be reflected on the printed versions of the thesis. That is, the title was at the top and very obvious, and then was the name of the professor in bold capital letters, in which that professor would be the presider and promoter of the disputation, followed by the announcement that the written thesis was due to oral presentation, the name of the candidate, the university where the disputatio was about to be held, and finally the date. Arguably, the dissertation at the time had also a biased academic hierarchy, just as when presenting it orally, as the order that the written thesis was set gives the meaning that the professor had the academic authority over the student for being at the upper podium and the respondent at the lower podium, who would climb the academic ladder to obtain his place at the former after the disputatio and subsequent graduation approval. Furthermore, it was also evident that the name of the professor/presider, written in bold with huge caps, being above the candidate's name, gives the sense that the author was rather the presider, with full authorship of the thesis, and the student being only the speaker, since the professor would promote the dissertation for oral presentation, and he also was the one who wrote the respondent's idea. This became a standard practice during the 18th century, as according to Prussian scholar Johannes Michaelis, there were probably factories of dissertations who published the candidate's thesis prescribed by the professors/presiders' names as their authors over the names of the respondents/candidates. Because, in the view of a presider, the theses were regarded as specimen of erudition, printed by the dissertation industry to be purchased by academic officials, members, or even nobles, and therefore those specimens were not considered yet works of doctors of philosophy. However, there were students who were admitted as authors of their academic ideas by some universities without having the burden of a professor presiding and promoting over them as a sort of establishing an academic fairness regarding authorship, if the disputatio for graduation was required, of course. Universities who had this system were German, and we have examples of universities such as Jena, Göttingen, and Bützow promoting students' authorship of writing their dissertations if there were graduation disputations, while the universities of Leipzig, Halle, and Tübingen only let the student writing their ideas on paper. Hello, students and graduates. Hope that you are enjoying this session so far. I just want to make a quick stop to say to you that if you like the content I bring about PhD studies and the late-night interviews with PhD students and want to support PhD Lounge, you can do so through one-time donations at Podfan and Buy Me a Coffee, where you can decide the amount you think PhD Lounge podcast deserves. Any grateful amount will help to increase the outreach quality of the podcast and engage with more PhD students who are interested in giving their voice and sharing their projects with anyone who wishes to study a PhD. To donate, visit pod.fan/PhD Lounge-podcast and buymeacoffee.com/PhD Lounge. Gratitude for your time, and let's carry on with the session. Moving to the 19th century, where the University of Berlin was founded by Humboldt and the degree Doctor of Philosophy became officially the top one, The concept of the doctoral dissertation was shaping differently, with less bureaucracy and a better structure within the university's statutes. German scholar Johann Fichte, who was the dean of this university between 1811 and 1812, alongside with his chair colleagues, reformed the Ph.D. dissertation, claiming that the Doctor of Philosophy degree attribution via dissertation was a writing specimen from whose students had full academic authorship or authorial academic persona, and the original writer of their thesis. Fichte believed that students were capable of producing an outstanding written thesis to be orally presented at a lower podium, examined and published to the satisfaction of their teachers without having an empowered professor/presider/promoter to write for him, and without being considered as a specimen of erudition over the last 3 centuries. Furthermore, Fichte based the doctoral dissertation on 2 qualities the student had to show to be awarded. Apologies for my German pronunciation. Eigentümlichkeit, meaning peculiarity, and Erfindungsvermögen, meaning creativity. In short, the Ph.D. dissertation, along with these new conditions, should therefore be a written work of research to serve and educate Prussia, which was facing an educational crisis due to a lack of new academic knowledge and qualifications amongst the Prussian population. Despite those enlightening reforms and innovations by Fichte and his colleagues that spread across other German universities, a complex issue still arose between their academic ideals and the German states. On one hand, the academic ideas suggested to be exercised were rather romantic and enlightening ideologies. Since the ages of Romanticism and Enlightenment, the radical one, were based on the author's emotions, individual liberty, geniality, and a return to the past, i.e., the Middle Ages. The German police state regarded that those ideas were not concrete and did not have a practical manner, since they were against modernity and rationalisation. On the other hand, the Imperial Ordinance Decree of 1731 was still in exercise within Prussia, where all academic guilds in each German state were forbidden by the ministerial police powers to write and publish specimens of erudition. This created an academic conflict between German Romantic and Enlightenment academics and the German modern thinking of pragmatism and rationalization, in which many theses in arts and science, written with an erudite vocabulary and creative genius, became useless and discarded by the German modern spirit of the doctoral thesis as work of research based on the imperial ordinance ideas. This problem lasted until the late 1820s, where the useless specimens of erudition dissertations written by academics with odd backgrounds and writing styles were being replaced by credited works of research made by academia students. Given the Doctor of Philosophy degree via dissertation became systematic, some German universities required the Ph.D. award through written theses, while others are awarded under other conditions, such as sympathy for a student in exchange of tuition fees or attending lectures. At the universities of Berlin and Bonn, for example, dissertations were mandatory and should have a brief biography of the candidate, written in Latin and printed by doctoral students at their expense unless they were funded with scholarships. Berlin in particular, doctoral dissertations would have 3 individuals on the title page for the disputation spoken in Latin, the doctoral candidate or candidates, and a Dr. Phil specialist. We can see from here that the modern spirit of rationalized work of research was having its seriousness in the 19th century, as German universities, and specifically Berlin, had many dissertations placed for public thesis defense in a day where most of them were in arts and science, mainly philosophy, history, maths, physics, and classics. Linguistics or natural sciences also existed, but they were very rare during the 1830s. The choice of a topic for the dissertation became also a conflict of interest between candidate and the professor, because for the former, his choice of the topic and subsequent views of their advisors or supervisors mattered the most, while for the professor, who ran seminars, was the interest of peer review within his specialization. At the University of Berlin, for instance, German philologist August Bock had a bias for cultural history since he coordinated seminars, and he rather gave preference to Greek and Roman Ph.D. topics, as for him, they were the bricks in the foundation of knowledge of antiquity, which were yet being discussed by the candidate's advisors before being written. This was a common thing back then, as professors used to persuade students to choose a topic that would encounter their research interests, making the popularity of German universities grow. This was called prosopography, which means many doctoral dissertations were written with topics based on ancient academics from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries who made peer reviews of those topics that were written before. Ironically, it was a silent return to the Romantic and Enlightenment ideas of creativity and originality in the individual's academic freedom. Regardless of this, the German view of the dissertation as work of research based on technical and rational models kept emerging, becoming the compulsory professional model for every university of the world. Doctoral candidates writing their thesis via dissertation by themselves and disputing them at the standard oral presentation. All these complex and bureaucratic systems around PhD dissertations lasting between the 16th century until the early 19th century would finally be taken out of the equation, giving space for the authorial academic persona to prosper and solidify the academic system and contribution of knowledge for good, and to be carried out today. But what about the models of the first PhD dissertations? Were they similar as they are today? The first PhD dissertation model was typically structured in 4 patterns of organization, which still continue to be the traditional style: introduction, methods, results, conclusions. These 4 sections reported more than a single study in which the introduction was a standalone chapter. Then the body contained various chapters based on subtopics of the topic under investigation, focusing on research articles conducted years prior and dissertations that were submitted only for examination at the researcher's own university, and then the results of those studies, and finally, general conclusions. Along the years, other forms of PhD dissertations appeared, such as dissertation by publication, meaning sharing conventional versions of the thesis project with features based on the topic under investigation in research articles, whilst writing the traditional thesis dissertation. As for pages, it varied, just like today, as there could be 20 pages, 50 pages, or over 100 pages, depending on the range of the chosen topic. Just an example, a PhD thesis written by Dr. William Arthur Parkes at the University of Toronto in Canada had 35 pages in 6 sections explaining a theory about the Huronian of the basin of the Meuse. Same as the PhD concept, the German style of the doctoral dissertation as work of research was spread across Europe and in the United States. In England and Scotland, the first PhD written dissertations appeared in the 1900s. At Cambridge University, Dr. Charles G. L. Wolfe wrote the first PhD dissertation in animal nutrition in 1909. Then the University of Oxford in 1914, whose first dissertation was written by Dr. Laxman Sarup in Sanskrit philology. University of Edinburgh, where Dr. Douglas Alexander wrote the first dissertation in geology at this institution in 1923, and in Glasgow, 1921, Dr. Lucy Agnes Carter wrote the first dissertation in protozoology, becoming the first woman in this university to write the first written thesis and the Ph.D. award. In the United States, the first Ph.D. written dissertation began at Yale University in 1861, where 3 Ph.D. students received their Doctor of Philosophy title. Only one dissertation is known, and it was written in Latin with the title Brevis Vita Ars Longa, Life is Short, Art is Long, written by Dr. Arthur Williams Wright. Yale's archives also show that between the first Ph.D. dissertation until 1927, over 1,000 dissertations were written there, where classic languages and literatures was the most researched topic. After Yale came Harvard University, where the first Ph.D. dissertation was written in 1873 by Dr. William E. Byerly in mathematics. Then was Columbia University in 1875, where Dr. Elwin Waller wrote about disinfections and disinfectants. Johns Hopkins University in 1878, whose first dissertation was on the history of taxation in the United States between 1789 and 1816 by Dr. Henry Carter Adams. Princeton University, with the first Ph.D. dissertation in 1879, written by 2 doctorates, Drs. William Lidley Jr. and W.M. MacDonald, about the contributions for the Museum of Geology and Archaeology of Princeton College. Rutgers University in 1884, Dartmouth College in 1885, Pennsylvania and Brown Universities in 1889, Chicago University in 1890, and many other American universities between 1870s and 1900s. And in the 21st century, how is the Ph.D. dissertation treated? According to Times Higher Education editor Paul Jump, Ph.D. dissertations on the eyes of academics have become a demoralizing conveyor belt, with students convincing themselves that writing a conventional thesis with different research methodologies and conclusions would be sufficient for an award at the Viva Voce. However, many of the teachers who supervise their doctoral students rather want Ph.D. dissertations through publications, which tends to be easier for them to evaluate original works of research and their contribution to knowledge. This system, though, does not favor Ph.D. students in general, as many candidates specializing in different fields do not have to follow this new system of Ph.D. per research publication, whilst writing the traditional written thesis, as the latter itself is already a contribution to knowledge. According to a pie chart from the UK Council for Graduate Education, 45% of Ph.D. projects rarely incorporate published papers, 38% allude to students that never do this, 12% of candidates often do, and 5% of them consider it a normal procedure. Either this new hybrid system or the traditional one, a Ph.D. dissertation based on the German-style work of research will remain the gemstone of any university in the world. Before wrapping up this session, here are some examples of famous Ph.D. dissertations that contributed for worldwide knowledge. Marie Curie in 1903, whose dissertation was about research on radioactive substances, which led to her Nobel Prize awards in physics in that year and in chemistry later in 1911. Albert Einstein's thesis, A New Determination on Molecular Dimensions, in 1906. Kim Eric Drexler and his project Molecular Machinery and Manufacturing with Applications to Computation in 1991, which led him to invent the field of molecular nanotechnology. Lev Vygotsky and his The Psychology of Art dissertation, which was written in 1925 but published later in 1960. Queen's guitarist Brian May and his thesis about a survey of radial velocities in the zodiacal dust cloud started in 1970 but completed 38 years later because of obvious reasons. Kate Millett and her Ph.D. thesis entitled Sexual Politics, which became published as a book in 1970, and the impulsionator of radical feminism, and many other doctoral theses. And with this, I finish this session. Once again, I say to you that finding key moments in different sources about the history of the PhD dissertation was not easy to find, as some of the information I used comes from blogs, websites, 2 books that I managed to find online, and 1 article. But in the end, writing this script was challenging, and also I learned something, that the current system of the PhD dissertation has only been over 200 years, therefore being young, but will continue for more years or even centuries. In my opinion, I think any student should be encouraged to go for a PhD and write a dissertation that in fact takes years of dedication and time to write a project, but remarkable and helpful at the same time if you want to go further in your future career and becoming doctors, whichever the field you are studying. If you enjoyed hearing this session and want me to continue to explore more content about PhD studies alongside future late-night interviews, consider leaving your feedback by writing an email at luisPhDlounge@gmail.com or join my Discord server, PhD Lounge Podcast, where you can find the channel #podcastfeedback. You can check my website too, phdlounge-podcast.com, where other sessions and late-night interviews at different podcast platforms, Spotify, Anchor FM, SoundCloud, and others are there, as well as my socials, Facebook at PhD PodLounge, Instagram at PhD LMF, and Twitter at PhD Launchcast. Thank you all for tuning in. It has been a pleasure.